Toni, lieber Tim, liebe Besucherinnen hier im Lilo-Hermann-Haus und auch online als Zoom-Teilnehmer, ich möchte alle für das Palästina-Komitee herzlich zu unserer Veranstaltung Der Zionismus während des Holocausts, die Instrumentalisierung der Erinnerung im Dienst von Staat und Nation begrüßen. Die Instrumentalisierung des Antisemitismusbegriffes durch die israelischen Regierungen und ihre nationalistischen Unterstützer hat auch hier in der PRD ein beklemmendes Ausmaß angenommen. Neben den Palästinenserinnen, die manchmal schon als Schulkinder als Antisemiten angegriffen werden, wenn sie nur den Begriff Palästina in den Mund nehmen, sind es auch häufig Jüdinnen und Juden, Oppositionelle, die unter solchen Angriffen zu leiden haben. Veranstaltungen von jüdischen Israelis, wie zum Beispiel der aus Jerusalem stammenden Judith Bernstein, werden auf Betreiben der deutsch-israelischen Gesellschaft abgesagt. Konten der jüdischen Stimme für gerechten Frieden werden infolge solcher Kampagnen von Privatbanken geschlossen. Bisweilen sind es die Antisemitismusbeauftragten selbst, wie zum Beispiel Michael Blume, hier in Baden-Württemberg, die Briefe auf amtlichem Papier des Staatsministeriums verfassen und hinterrücks an Institutionen schicken, um Veranstaltungen mit oppositionellen jüdischen Israelis zu verhindern. Dies geschah zum Beispiel vor kurzem mit einer Veranstaltung der GIW in Heidelberg, wo Shir Heber über Kinderarbeit in Palästina sprechen sollte. Dabei können sich die Attackierenden übrigens auf ultrarechte Kräfte verlassen. Es sind die AfD, rechte Evangelikale, Leute der Pax- und Pegida-Bewegung, die an allererster Stelle die Kritikerinnen israelischer Regierungen angreifen und harte Maßnahmen gegen den sogenannten Antisemitismus fördern, wenn es darum geht, den Menschenrechtsverletzungen der israelischen Regierungen entgegenzutreten. Ganz genauso handeln in Italien Giorgia Meloni von den italienischen Faschisten Fratelli d'Italia, in Frankreich Marine Le Pen oder der ganz offensichtlich antijüdische ungarische Staatschef Viktor Orban. Sie alle bezeichnen sich als enge Freunde des Staates Israel. Umso wichtiger ist der Beitrag von Toni Greenstein, der in seinem neuen Buch analysiert, wie die zionistische Bewegung und die israelischen Regierungen mit Antisemiten in der Geschichte umgegangen sind und aktuell noch umgehen. Toni stärkt mit seinem Buch entscheidend den Widerstand gegen die Ultrarechte und den Faschismus. Wer in Tonis Buch schaut, sieht gleich am Anfang, dass er seine Studien dem jüdischen und nicht-jüdischen Widerstand gegen den Nazifaschismus gewidmet hat. Dazu gehörte auch Lilo Hermann, deren Namen das linke Zentrum hier trägt. Wir danken den Verantwortlichen des Lilo Hermann Hauses dafür, dass wir heute diesen sehr geeigneten Veranstaltungsraum nutzen können, der wirklich zum Thema passt. Toni Greenstein ist schon lange unser Freund. Er kämpft seit Jahrzehnten gegen Faschismus und gegen die Unterdrückung der Palästinenserinnen. Bedanken möchten wir uns natürlich auch bei Tim Slater, der heute die wichtige Aufgabe der Übersetzung vom Englischen ins Deutsche und umgekehrt natürlich übernehmen wird. Und jetzt will ich nicht mehr viel sagen, sondern an Toni übergeben. Für Toni.
Welcome to this talk. This talk is based on my book, Zionism During the Holocaust. Historians investigate all sorts of different topics, but there is a curious lack of investigation about what the role of Zionism itself as a movement was during the Holocaust. Too many have died because of a false narrative. We only see yesterday 11 people died, over 100 were injured in Nablus. Too many Palestinians have died because of the myth that Israel inherits the memory of those who died in the Holocaust. Today you would think, from what the Zionists themselves propagate, that the Holocaust was their main concern during the Holocaust. But during the Holocaust, and this is really the substance of my talk, the Zionist movement was concerned with one thing and one thing only, and that was building and creating a Jewish state. The Holocaust was really an afterthought. They were not concerned with it in any measure or shape. But Germany today in Europe is the strongest supporter of Israel, the Jewish state, and Zionism. And of course there is a reason for that, because Israel has helped the German state, which was never incidentally denazified, to expiate its guilt over the Holocaust. We are not told, for example, what the real reasons were for the rise of the Nazis, nor are we told, and I suspect you're not told, because I used to teach German students, about the causes and who supported the Nazis in their rise to power. If you like, the Holocaust has been rewritten in order not only to forgive the German state, but in the words of Yitzhak Laor, who is the most famous Israeli poet, I'll give it you, to consolidate a new ideology of exclusion. Now it is the Jews who are the insiders. The genocide in the Jews served in the construction of a European identity. There is a whole series of Zionist Holocaust historians based on Yad Vashem, which is the state institute for the museum. It's a museum of the Holocaust remembrance in Jerusalem. And the main theme, if you like, of Zionist history, historiography, is that the Holocaust was a culmination of a war against the Jews. This, of course, ignores the reasons for the rise of the Nazis, which, in my opinion, was quite clearly the destruction of the German labour movement, the organisations of the German working class. But also, of course, excluded from the Holocaust are the Gypsy Roma, the Sinti, the disabled, and the Holocaust really began with the murder of the disabled in 1939, not in 1941. I mean, I don't know how much you know about the rise of Hitler, but between 1930 and 1933, the Nazis played down, almost to the point of non-existence, their anti-Semitism. Their main theme was anti-Bolshevism, anti-Marxism, and their hatred, and Hitler's in particular, of the Jews was because they were seen as the biological parents of Marxism. Hitler, if you read Mein Kampf, talks about Judeo-Bolshevism. That was his phrase. The Israeli state was brought into being. It was created by the Zionist movement. But what is Zionism? Who were the first Zionists? The original ideas for Zionism, the first Zionists were not Jewish, they were Christian. The first Christian Zionists were people like Napoleon, Lord Shaftesbury, Lord Palmerston. If you are students of English literature, George Eliot and Daniel Deronda. Why? Because Britain wanted a Jewish state, or a state that it could control or rely on, adjacent to the Suez Canal, which is the route to India. Zionism would have you believe that for 2,000 years, Jews dreamed of nothing else but returning to Palestine. So I ask the question, if that was true, why did they not return? I mean, there was nothing stopping a Jew in the 14th or 15th century going to Palestine and living there. In fact, many Orthodox Jews did, to live, to study the Torah, the Bible, and they died there living on charity. But, you know, if you were in the 15th, 16th century, there were no passports, there were no borders, the Ottoman Empire did not stop you entering. Why did they not go? Today, if you support the Palestinians or if you're an anti-Zionist, you will inevitably be accused of anti-Semitism. But when Zionism first arose, the supporters of Zionism were accused of anti-Semitism. For those who understand, Theodor Herzl, has anyone heard of him? Yeah. He was the founder of political Zionism. And he visited the royal houses of Europe and nobility, and he visited someone called the Grand Duke of Baden, who was the uncle of the Kaiser. And Herzl had a conversation with him, and the Grand Duke said, yes, I support you. But the only problem is, if I say that openly, I will be accused of anti-Semitism. Because the anti-Semites wanted to get rid of the Jews, so they supported Zionism. That's in the diaries of Herzl. There's 4 volumes, 1,600 pages, but I've read them all. The first Zionist Congress was held in 1897 in Basel, in Switzerland. But in fact, it was supposed to be held in Munich. The only problem was the Jewish community lobbied and petitioned the authorities and said, why are you allowing an anti-Semitic conference to be held in our town? And it was therefore not allowed. But you won't read that in history. In essence, Zionism was seen as a form of Jewish anti-Semitism, because the main people who supported Zionism were the anti-Semites. They didn't want the Jews in their country, so they should go to a Jewish state. And I quote, and I'll give it you, the quote, it's from Samuel Montague, who was a British MP and later Lord Swathering. And he wrote, is it not a suspicious fact that those who have no love for the Jews and those who are pronounced anti-Semites all seem to welcome the Zionist proposals and aspirations? Zionism was a reaction to anti-Semitism. It was after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. The Zionist movement was the first inspiration for the Zionist movement. It was a distinct movement, but and I'll come on to that. As a result, about 2.5 million Jews fled or escaped or emigrated from Europe as a result of the pogroms in Russia, in Odessa and other places between the mid-19th century and 1914. Of them, 1% went to Palestine, and 99% went to Britain or to France or the United States. And this is the answer to those who say the Jews really wanted to go to Palestine. A.B. Yehoshua, who's just died, he was a left Zionist poet, very famous. I mean, you don't get many honest Zionists today. But Yehoshua enjoyed speaking the truth to his own, to Zionists. He wanted to shake them out of their stupor. And he wrote, or he spoke, this was a lecture, it's in the Jewish Chronicle, and he wrote, or said, anti-Zionism is not the product of the non-Jews. On the contrary, the Gentiles, the non-Jews, have always encouraged Zionism, hoping that it would help rid them of the Jews in their midst. Even today, in a perverse way, a real anti-Semite must be a Zionist. Zionism was unique amongst the Jewish reactions to anti-Semitism. Why? Because it held that anti-Semitism could not be fought. It was inherent in the non-Jew. Its cause was the Jews themselves. Because the Jews did not have a country of their own, that produced anti-Semitism. And I'll give you a couple of quotes. The first Zionist who founded the Lovers of Zion in 1882 was a man by the name of Leon Pinsker. And he wrote, and he said, well, in fact he wrote, anti-Semitism, or he called it Judeophobia, because he was a doctor, so it was a fear of Jews, is a mental disease. And as a mental disease, it is hereditary, because that was what was believed at the time, that mental diseases were hereditary. And having been inherited for 2,000 years, it is incurable. And Herzl, he wrote, I think it's page 7 of his diaries, he wrote in 1895, and remember, 1895 was in the middle of the Dreyfus affair, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And he wrote, in Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon, to forgive. Above all, I recognized the emptiness and futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism. And in fact, Zionism really understood anti-Semitism. They thought it was justified in many ways because they understood that if Jews were a separate race or nation, then they had no right to be in someone else's land. And I quote Jacob Klatskin, who was the editor of the Zionist newspaper Die Welt, and he was a co-founder of the Encyclopedia Judaica. And he wrote, and I'll give it to you again, if we do not admit the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, we deny the rightfulness of our own nationalism. Instead of establishing societies for defence against the anti-Semites who want to reduce our rights, we should establish societies for defence against our friends who desire to defend our rights. And one of the fundamental founding principles of the Zionist movement is something called the negation of the diaspora and the return to Palestine. Indeed, if you listen to some of the Zionists and you didn't know who was speaking, you would think they were anti-Semites. For example, I'll give you a few quotes. Jacob Klatskin again held that Jews were a people disfigured in both body and soul. In a word, a horror, some sort of outlandish creature, some sort of oddity amongst the people going by the name of Jew. Hashem HaTzeh, which was a left-wing Zionist group, held that a Jew is a caricature of a normal, natural human being, both physically and spiritually. As an individual in society, he revolts and throws off the harness of social obligations and knows of no order or discipline. Jabotinsky, who was the founder of revisionist Zionism, Menachem Begin, Likud, in essence, he said the Jewish people is a very bad people. Its neighbours hate it, and rightly so. Its only salvation lies in a general immigration to the land of Israel. And Arthur Rupin, who was, I'll give you all of these, who was probably the second most important person in pre-state Israel, Palestine. When a friend called him an anti-Semite, he replied, I've already established here that I despise the cancers of Judaism more than does the worst anti-Semite, referring to his diary. So I come to the question, what was the Zionist attitude to the rise of the Nazis? And the best, or one of the best descriptions is from a critical Zionist historian, Noah Lucas, who wrote The Modern History of Israel, and I quote, as the European Holocaust erupted, Ben-Gurion was the first Prime Minister of Israel and chaired the Jewish Agency, saw it as a decisive opportunity for Zionism. In conditions of peace, Zionism could not move the masses of world Jewry. The forces unleashed by Hitler, in all their horror, must be harnessed to the advantage of Zionism. By the end of 1942, the struggle for a Jewish state became the primary concern of the movement. What was the reaction of the Jewish people worldwide to the rise of Hitler? It was to immediately launch a boycott of Nazi Germany, which you will not hear about much today, because of course boycotts are held to be anti-Semitic, BDS. But in fact, boycott was the initial reaction of most Jewish people. That is, not to buy German goods. And it was very effective in many ways. Yeah. The one group who opposed it, well, there were two groups. One was the Jewish bourgeoisie, the Jewish capitalists. And the second one, of course, was the Zionist movement itself. One of the... on June the 21st, 1933, the Zionist Federation of Germany sent a letter to Hitler, who was never answered. This was voluntary. It was, no one forced them to do that. And if I can read, and it is, I think, going to be on the slide. In fact, you can see it there, can't you? Can you read it? And it reads, Zionism has no illusions about the difficulty of the Jewish condition, which comes above all in an abnormal occupational pattern and in the fault of an intellectual and moral posture not rooted in one's own tradition. What they mean was that there were too many Jewish intellectuals and not enough Jewish workers. An answer to the Jewish question, truly satisfying to the national state, can only be brought about with the collaboration of the Jewish movement that aims at a social, cultural and moral renewal of Jewry. You have to remember that in 1933, Zionism was not popular amongst German Jews. Approximately 2% supported the Zionist movement. What was the attitude? I mean, some Zionists actually welcomed the advent of Hitler. I don't say they welcomed the Holocaust, because that was 1933, not 1941. But nonetheless, they could see only positive things in the rise of the Nazis. I'll give you a few examples. Berl Katznelson, I've got it here, so yeah. Berl Katznelson, who was the deputy to Ben-Gurion, wrote, he saw the rise of Hitler as, quote, an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or ever will have. Ben-Gurion was even more optimistic. The Nazis' victory would become a fertile force for Zionism. I'll give you a couple of more quotes. The first is from someone called Chaim Nachman Bialik. He is the national poet of the Zionists. And he wrote, Hitlerism has perhaps saved the Jews, the German Jewry, which was being annihilated into assimilation. For the Zionists, assimilation was the worst enemy. It means you're no longer a Jewish because you've married someone who's not Jewish. And Emma Ludwig, who was a world-famous biographer and a Zionist, said, Hitler will be forgotten in a few years, but he will have a beautiful monument in Palestine. You know, the coming of the Nazis was rather a welcome thing. Thousands who seemed to be completely lost to Judaism were brought back to the fold by Hitler, which is true because those who were baptized and were Christians were still Jewish for the Nazis. And for that, I'm personally very grateful to him. But the attitude of the Zionist leadership, and I make a distinction between ordinary Zionists who were anti-Hitler but the Zionist leadership, was summed up by Rabbi Joachim Prinz. He was a leader of German Jewry. He later became deputy of the American Jewish Congress and deputy chair of the World Jewish Congress. And he said, and I'll give you this quote, just this quote, "It was morally disturbing to seem to be considered as the favoured children of the Nazi government, particularly when it dissolved the anti-Zionist youth groups and seemed in other ways to prefer the Zionists. The Nazis asked for a more Zionist behaviour of the Jews." But as I said, not only did the Zionists in many cases welcome the Nazis, but the Nazis preferred the Zionists amongst the German Jewish population because they were the national, the racial Jews. And in January, 28th of January 1935, Reinhard Heydrich, you know who the Heydrich is? Yes, he was called the engineer of the final solution. He issued a directive. He was a deputy head of the SS, the Reich Security Main Office. And he issued a directive stating the activity of the Zionist-oriented youth organisations that are engaged in the occupational restructuring of the Jews lies in the interest of the National Socialist state leadership. They are not to be treated with that strictness that is necessary to apply to the members of the so-called German Jewish organisations, brackets, assimilations. In other words, the other 98% of German Jews. You will have heard, no doubt, you'll be aware of Kristallnacht. In November 9th and 10th of 1938, it was the first Nazi pogrom. As a result of that, the British offered to admit 10,000 Jewish children. What was the reaction of the Zionists? And I quote from Ben-Gurion's statement to Mapai, the Israeli Labour Party, on the 9th of December 1938. If I can explain the attitude of the Zionist movement to rescue throughout the war, was that there was no reason they opposed rescue of Jews if it was to anywhere but Palestine. Why? Because that was only shifting anti-Semitism to another country. And he said, quote, "If I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to Eretz Yisrael," that was Palestine at the time, "then I would opt for the second alternative, for we must weigh not only the life of the children, but also the history of the people of Israel." I wanted to very briefly touch on, and it is very brief, Rudolf Weber, who was the first, with Alfred Wetzler, who was the first Jewish escapee from Auschwitz. He escaped on the 10th of April 1944, and he reached Slovakia on 2 weeks later, 24th of April 1944. And he and his friend wrote down something called the Auschwitz Protocols. Before that, Auschwitz was always thought of as a labour camp, not an extermination camp. And the protocols were given to the leader of Hungarian Zionism on April the 29th. But what did he do with it? He suppressed it. Although you won't hear about it today, from 1954 to 1958 in Israel, there was what was known as the Kastner trial. Kastner was accused of collaborating with the Nazis, and the state of Israel sued the person who made the allegations, Malchiel Greenstein. And in 1955, the Jerusalem District Court, Benjamin Halevi, found that Kastner was a collaborator. He had, and I quote, sold his soul to Satan. Hungary was the last Jewish community, major Jewish community, which had not been destroyed. The Nazis invaded it in March 19th, 1944. And within 3 months, they had exterminated nearly 500,000 Jews. And Rudolf Verber wrote, this was in the Daily Herald, the British paper, "I am a Jew. In spite of that, indeed because of that, I accused certain Jewish leaders of one of the most ghastly deeds of the war. This small group of quislings knew what was happening to their brethren in Hitler's gas chambers and bought their own lives with the price of silence. Amongst them was Dr. Kastner. I was able to give Hungarian Zionist leaders 3 weeks' notice that Eichmann planned to send 1 million of their Jews to the gas chambers. Kastner went to Eichmann and told him, I know of your plans, spare some Jews of my choice, and I shall keep quiet." And the second Israeli government under Moshe Sharet fell as a result of the verdict in Kastner, but today you will hear nothing about that. And I quoted Heydrich, his directive, saying that German Jewish anti-Zionist groups were not allowed to hold meetings. From 1936, none or anti-Zionist Jewish group could hold a meeting, whereas Zionist groups were legal until 1939. I think we should bear this in mind when today's German government attacks anti-Zionists, often Jewish anti-Zionists, because they're following in the footsteps of the Nazi government, which also attacked Jewish anti-Zionists. But this is an irony lost on the government, the Berlin state government, amongst others. Zionism, for socialists anyway, the lesson of the Holocaust is that racism and fascism must be fought. The lesson for Zionism is that nationalism, militarism and racism are justified. And this was summed up very well by Gideon Levy. I don't know whether you've heard of him, but he is a columnist, a weekly column for Haaretz, which is a major Israeli newspaper. Because every year, in fact throughout the year, thousands of Israeli school children visit Auschwitz, and they have a march from Auschwitz to Birkenau, about 3 kilometers, covered in Israeli national flags. And he wrote, I have yet to hear, and I've got it here for you, I have yet to hear a single teenager come back from Auschwitz and say that we mustn't abuse others the way we were abused. There has yet to be a school whose pupils came back from Birkenau, straight to the Gaza border, saw the barbed wire fence and said, never again. The message is always the opposite. Gaza is permitted because of Auschwitz. Yeah. And this is important because it depends. Why do we remember the Holocaust? Presumably because there are lessons to be learned. And the lesson for the West, of course, is that Israel must be supported, which is the world's only apartheid state. I mentioned Yad Vashem, which is the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Museum. It is situated very near the village which used to be called Deir Yassin. It's now Givat Shaul. And in 2009, a guide showing around people in Yad Vashem, mentioned to the people he was showing around that Deir Yassin was just literally about 300-400 yards away. He was sacked, dismissed on the spot.
Yeah.
Deir Yassin, I didn't mention, was the site of the most famous massacre in 1948, April 1948. I give another example. Nir Gontarz, who was a journalist also on Haaretz. When Netanyahu proposed to expel in 2014 the 60,000 black African refugees from Eritrea and Sudan mainly, who were in Israel, he rang up Yad Vashem and he described the reaction. One after the other of the senior staff there, including Mr. Avner Shalev, the director, slammed the phone down on me when I asked to speak to them. I've spoken for a long time and I think it's right that you should ask some questions and contributions. All I want to say is today the best friends of the Israeli state are people like Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Anti-Semites, the Alternative for Germany. It's the strongest supporter, riddled with neo-Nazis, as we know. In Britain, Tommy Robinson. So today you see what you always have seen, which is the strongest supporters for Zionism come from the racist far right. Despite the accusations that it is a left who is anti-Semitic, the reality is, of course, very different. Right. As I say, I've spoken for a long time. My book will be on sale. I've only been able to cover a really short part of it, but my book will be on sale, €15 for a paperback. There's only one hardback, I'm afraid. I couldn't carry that many. And you're welcome to buy it, and you're welcome to ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer.